Yeah, so I am thrilled to be here and very excited about this show, which, as Alicia said, is the first museum show of these new portraits, which I think is kind of both surprising and thrilling. And the installation I just find fantastic. So we can talk more about that afterwards. I'm happy to entertain any questions or debates or comments. I must confess, though, I'm a little bit nervous. When some of these pictures were shown at the Gagosian Gallery in New York in 2014, as seen here, that show elicited unaccustomed vitriol, online trolling, and at least 5 lawsuits against Richard Prince. Everything Prince does seems to stir up controversy, real anger, lawsuits, and headlines. Why, just the other day, I heard that one of Detroit's biggest Instagram stars objected to having her portrait in this very exhibition. So I hope we have time to talk about that protest and its implications in the city and Prince's art more generally. Richard Prince's continuing status as art's bad boy owes in part to its common sense defying audacity, which always seems to lead to the question, is it art? But also to the seemingly endless capacity of wealthy art collectors to pay outlandish sums to possess his outrages. Ivanka Trump paid $36,000 for her portrait before Prince denounced it as a work of art and sent the check back. The methods employed in such gestures can often make his work seem like an easy provocation. But I would argue that Prince's actions and appropriations, his flagrant taking and repositioning of images and objects and language from what is already out there in popular culture, are all carefully chosen, well thought out, and meaningful for the viewers. He deliberately and skillfully challenges conventional notions of art, communication, identity, celebrity, sexuality, privacy, ethics, and class values. With deft and seemingly simple gestures, Prince excavates deep social, psychological, and even moral predispositions. First, I suppose, I should be clear about my own criteria for what I think make artworks, or anything cultural, really, interesting. That is beyond aesthetics and decorative appeal. Ideally, all art or other cultural objects should, first of all, make us think about or view the world differently. But more than that, these things in the world should give us a framework, a critical apparatus for reshaping our own ways of looking and acting. And this in turn gives us a way to calibrate our own value systems, what appeals to us and what doesn't, and why, all to gauge future actions. The best works, in my opinion, are those that avoid fixity and easy resolution, those that we can return to again and again and still not fully understand, those that remain pleasurable and meaning-producing, in a word, provocative. Such works of art, music, film, books are in a sense autobiographical, not for what they tell us about the artist or author or creator, but for what they tell us about ourselves. Given this working formula, I see 4 main factors that make Richard Prince's work significant. 1, the sheer aesthetic originality of his approach, including bold recontextualizing and reworking of borrowed imagery from familiar cultural forms, a practice generally called appropriation. 2, the recognition that the collecting and regrouping of cultural forms from the past 50 years or so, books, photographs, artworks, artifacts, images, can itself serve as a commentary on the issues of gender, sexuality, wealth, celebrity, and art. 3, the understanding that all these choices of images and objects create new meanings, reflecting the responses or autobiographical reflections not only of the artist but of the viewer. And 4, this intervention in the free circulation of objects and images in the public sphere is itself a form of critical commentary, both on the original forms and on the specific social, historical, and political conditions governing their original production and their later circulation. Central to Richard Prince's work and to the audience's perception and understanding of it is his relation to the concept of appropriation, the taking of an image from one context and replacing it in another, and then claiming ownership for that secondary use. Appropriation is for Prince like a drip is for Pollock. For many general viewers, the thought that one could reformulate an idea or image merely by removing it from one context and placing it in another, and then take credit for that act, is shocking. This strategy is often likened to stealing. But this sort of action has a long history in specialized researches of modern avant-garde art. Indeed, some critics argue that appropriation is the central animating concept behind much art making during the modern period, often citing Marcel Duchamp's recognition of Renibades or Warhol's reuse of Campbell's soup cans or other household staples. But Prince's work is entirely different, as it provides a built-in critical commentary on the disorienting, even disembodying experience of the image-saturated media world of the United States after 1977. At that time, a group of young conceptual artists, mostly in New York City, including Richard Prince, Sherry Levine, Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, and Cyril Charlesworth, among others, were experimenting with the taking and repositioning of widely available images and languages. These so-called postmodern artists had been raised on television and advertising, and they regarded such mediated photo representations as their landscapes, their still lives, their portraits. In fact, it is surprising how much these artists attended to rethinking pictures of people, representations of social identity, portraits. In 1979, for example, Sherry Levine challenged the notion of the unitary artist or author actually appropriating the work of Walker Evans, such as this Depression-era portrait from 1936, and claiming it as her own, signing her name to the otherwise unchanged work. These postmodern artists saw their self-images as constructions, not something coming from within, but cobbled together from the external world of films, magazines, promotional posters, and publicity photographs. Once removed, authorless images that carried the authority of the real, but with no specific basis in reality. For postmodern artists of the 70s and 80s, this was their social world and their visual context, consisting of simultaneously hyperbolic and banal photographs. Cindy Sherman, from 1977 to 1980, made her small, untitled film stills, like the one you see here, riffing on the stereotypical female stars of grade B films, but all starring herself, as if those film roles were fragments of her own collaged persona. And recognizing that words and texts were as powerfully conventional and shaping as pictures, Barbara Kruger, in works like Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face, 1981, uses pronouns and found imagery to drive home the feminist message that images of women, their portraits, were and are shaped to a large degree by the male gaze. Borrowing text and images from one context and placing them in another to change the meaning or to create new content seemed like a relevant, even necessary aesthetic gesture. Crucial to both Kruger's and Prince's appropriation of such found imagery was the notion of rephotography. I think it was Prince who actually invented that word. Prince said, quote, "Looking through the lens and cropping out everything but the image is what rephotography is all about. It is hard to explain the sensation of what you see through the camera when what you are looking at is another photograph or a flat two-dimensional image." Prince, seen here in a twin portrait with Cindy Sherman, is in many respects the most well-known proponent of appropriation art of that period, in part due to the fact that he has stuck with it more doggedly than some of his colleagues, facing down the social functions and legal determination of the reuse of images. Since 1977, Prince has centered his art around this singular strategy of image reuse, not because it's easy and effortless, but because it adds a crucial critical commentary to images already in circulation around us. His early cowboys, for example, used details of Marlboro advertising to comment not only on the pervasiveness of cigarette advertising, but also on the way it manipulated stereotypes of masculinity to transfer the connotations of cowboy style to the coolness of cigarette smoking. For this purpose, the images were, as Prince said, quote, "too good to be true." And as they were unsigned, apparently they were out there for the taking in the public domain. That's what he thought, at least. In my opinion, appropriation constitutes a radical transformation of the original image or text through one or more key intellectual strategies. These may include, one, conversion of authorship, as we saw in Sherry Levine; two, aesthetic alteration by moving a visual or textual element from one context and altering it through recombination, collage, juxtaposition, or new words and colors; three, recontextualization by providing a new context for the presentation of the work through relocation to a substantially different environment or venue. That is, by placing the work in proximity to other works that are related or unrelated, by resituating the work in a new educational or intellectual context, even without otherwise altering it. The secondary use substantially alters the understanding and interpretation of the original work. Four, pastiche or parody by creating a replica of another work or style, even without otherwise altering it. The secondary use may comment directly or indirectly on the original work for the purpose of homage or derision. And five, cultural commentary. By replicating a work, the secondary use may invoke, either directly or indirectly, an implicit political critique and an acute awareness of specific social and historical circumstances. In other words, simply by pointing to that specific image. In all such cases, the intentions and motivations of the creators are of measurably less significance than the uses made of them by the observer or audience. It is the way the image lands that determines its message, and Prince aims to shape or determine that meaning. One can see in Prince's appropriations an almost singular focus on people, on portraits even, amid his deep, almost anthropological interest in the visual languages and vernacular argot of American subcultures and popular culture in the post-war period, particularly as it involves gender and sexuality. When Prince first adopted found photographs for his portraits in the early 1980s, he wrote, "I take portraits of people. When I take these portraits, I'm not interested in who the people are as much as I am in who they might be when they are in a photograph." He has studied, repeated, and recreated the sexually tantalizing allure of 1970s advertising imagery in his cowboy series, the tawdry glamour of Times Square burlesque in his entertainer series, the seedy gender play of motorcycle magazine portraits in his Girlfriends series, seen here, and the misogynistic social world of 1950s Borscht Belt cocktail humor in his Jokes. The Girlfriends were snapshots of the girlfriends of bikers. They're amateur portraits, ones that men would send to the biker magazines for publication. In each of these cases, Prince has reworked the original material to comment on the illusions of frustrated desire. As the Jokes make clear, language is crucial to Prince's work. In addition to his visible role as a visual artist, Prince is a distinguished and prolific American writer who's published several books of fiction and prose, including Why I Go to the Movies Alone, seen here, Wild History, and collected works in the bookstore. In the new portrait series, and the portrait series shown here, the text is crucial and transformative. Prince is clearly fascinated by the subtle and experimental use of language in social media, the intimacy of the discourse, the invented words, the new slang, the emojis. This play with language, which he sometimes calls gibberish, is inserted as commentary to amplify the Instagram portraits that he appropriates, and it's key to the invented effects of these new portraits. Critic Jerry Saltz says, Prince is creating a rock and roll, hip-hop ghetto patois of street dude, hipster, showman, Vegas lounge lizard, flim-flammer, voyeur, and hunter. I'm not sure if that's good, but such inventive use of language transforms the meaning and perception of Graham and McNutt's mute portraits that we will come to. In one notorious appropriation, Prince went so far as to exactly reprint J.D. Salinger's novel Catcher in the Rye, substitute his own name, and declare it his artwork to comment on Salinger's reclusiveness, the rare book trade, and more generally, the centrality of that novel to post-war American literature. The fact that such borrowing pushes the theoretical boundaries of existing free speech, plagiarism, and copyright laws does not seem to be Prince's motive or interest, although the consequences of his actions have had significant effect on legal understandings of the ownership of the image. I think it's useful now to look at two of Prince's new portraits, not in this show, but in the previous one, both of which are currently embroiled in a landmark legal case over these questions of ownership and copyright. Following the 2014 exhibition of new portraits at the Gagosian Gallery, two photographers whose work Prince had appropriated from the internet sued him for copyright infringements. You may have heard about this. In one, Prince uses Donald Graham's photograph, seen here. Here's the Donald Graham original, Rastafarian smoking a joint, while the other appropriates a portrait of musician Kim Gordon from this original by photographer Eric McNatt, reproduced in Paper magazine. Prince deleted some comments and added some of his own, but left the photographs largely unaltered. In 2018, the US District Court judge refused Prince's request for straight-ahead dismissal of the lawsuits, and the case moved forward. It's still unresolved. The legal question at hand concerns ownership of the image and the legal term, fair use. In other words, under what circumstances can all or part of a creative work be reused by another maker and not be considered a copyright violation? Notwithstanding the general understanding and widespread use of appropriation as a key artistic gesture within modern art, the two cases consider a rather more narrow legal view afforded by recent interpretations. The operative legal understanding for fair use asserted by District Court Judge Pierre Laval in his 1990 Harvard Law Review essay, Toward a Fair Use Standard, requires above all that the secondary use, the appropriative use, Richard Prince's use, must be transformative. That is, having changed the original in some material way, or by having represented it, given the original use new meaning or expression. Most importantly, Judge Laval stated, quote, if the secondary use adds value to the original, if the quoted matter is used as raw material and transformed in the creation of new information, new aesthetics, new insights, and new understandings, this is the very type of activity that the fair use doctrine intends to protect for the enrichment of society. Transformation is, in such cases, based on how the secondary work may be reasonably conceived as different, adding new meaning. These two standards, physical or intellectual transformation and the perceptions of a general viewer, rely on subjective responses of a reasonably knowledgeable observer. Both of these standards rely on context for interpretation. Physical transformation is not a general or easily defined standard. While such changes may include apparent physical traits such as size, color, and content, other aspects such as collateral elements, additive elements, juxtaposed images, substrate or surface qualities, as well as the general and specific context of presentation, all greatly affect the viewer's perception of the work. In the case of Prince's new portraits, the screen captures from the internet have been rephotographed, refocused, re-edited, amplified by original additive text elements, enlarged, printed on canvas, mounted, and presented in a new public context radically different from the original ephemeral display on the internet. For example, the radical difference between the streaming and communicative function of the internet, where sharing photographs and textual messages is implicit and largely unregulated, and the selective and highly mediated context of a fine art gallery is itself sufficient to establish a new meaning for these works. Moreover, it seems that one of Prince's key purposes in the new portraits, not lost on critics or audiences, was to comment on the culture of the internet itself, the sharing, the commenting, the posing, the sampling, the retweeting, all new versions of appropriation and recontextualization, sponsored by the original makers as much as by Prince himself. How has Prince used this content as raw material to elicit new meaning. First, while Graham's and McNatt's photographs are intended as portraits, meant to convey all meaning about an individual or type in a single image, Prince's versions clearly refer to the ways these portraits are already transformed by Instagram as a medium of communication. In images, Prince's work represents posts from Instagram, such as the posting information from Rasta J92 and from Richard Prince 4, as well as an indication of the number of likes and comments from various users, including Richard Prince 4. Secondly, representing an image that incorporates another image incidentally seems, in my opinion, not to violate the intent or spirit of copyright law. The representation is not claiming the secondary use as a substitute for the original. It is a wholly new object with new meaning. From a photographic point of view, this claiming otherwise would be as if the Coca-Cola bottling company objected to an Ansel Adams landscape that happened to show a Coca-Cola billboard in view. Prince has deliberately selected these specific photographs from the stream of internet images, altered them in several significant ways, and remixed these images as one would use other sources or raw materials through displacement and addition to create new thoughts and new ideas. Prince's new meaning involves a clear commentary on the circulation of images on the internet, particularly as that circulation involves a distinct popular language comprised of images, text, abbreviations, and emojis, often represented without apparent authors. Prince's work draws attention to the viewer's recognition of not only the ubiquity of conventionalized images on the internet, but also how their meaning can be transformed by recombination, replacement on other sites, and additive commentary, either in written language or visual language of emojis. In this case, the addition of comments and the internet context to Graham's and McNatt's fairly neutral images has made their uses and meanings far more complex. Instead of neutral, the Rastafarian and the female rocker can be regarded as demeaning, stereotypical, even racially or sexually insensitive portraits, an interpretation amplified and satirized by Prince's textual additions in pidgin Rasta speech and emojis. Lastly, it should be noted that Graham's and McNatt's objections to Prince's use of the secondary image point directly to the issue of context. It's not sufficient, in my opinion, to simply compare the central images of two works side by side, which we can do. Looking only at what is contained within the frame, so to speak. Rather, it is always necessary to see the framing elements of context, including the exhibition venue, juxtapositions with other elements and texts and images, and with other works in a series or sequence, or post, for that matter. Whereas Graham and McNatt regard their images as singular, standalone portraits. Prince's images are demonstrably part of a series. This fact is exemplified by the original gallery exhibition and is reiterated in the billboard advertising for the new portraits exhibition, which specifically showed multiple images from the sequence. By providing multiple examples of Prince's approach in the advertising, that billboard demonstrated that the series is paramount as it is here in the galleries. The series provides a crucial context. Let's take a look. The series provides a crucial context for understanding Prince's image as part of an overall ensemble, a cultural commentary on the internet, on the intimate, personal exchanges in Instagram communications, and on the sexualized and racialized subcultures who represent themselves in image and in speech on Instagram. Another view. It is clear, I think, that the removal and replacement of an image from one context or sequence to another context and sequence inevitably alters the meaning of that image. This axiom is widely accepted culturally by now, both in the specialized languages of contemporary art and in the more popular vernacular of social media, music, and film. In discussing the new portraits, Prince has said that he wanted to, quote, reimagine traditional portraiture and bring to a canvas and art gallery a physical representation of the virtual world of social media. Prince's work is a cultural investigation into the sign language of American post-war culture. It is about him, but is always apart from him. I would describe all of his works and activities: writing, bookmaking, book collecting, art making, art collecting, painting, photography, and writing as fragments, or better yet, figments of a persona that is always out there. They are less self-portraits than variant responses to an inkblot Rorschach test. In the story by Richard Prince called The Thomas Crown Affair, he said, quote, "My desires have nothing to do with what comes from myself, because what I will eventually put out will, in a sense, already have been out there." Thank you. Time elapsed 31 minutes. If you have any questions or comments or rants, I'd be happy to engage.
I'm going to bring you the microphone.
You have to use the microphone.
If you could speak into the microphone, that way everybody can hear the question. And we're recording this, so that way your question is recorded.
So I have two things. First of all, I would wonder what he has to say about the China trade wars we're having right now, which has to do with a lot of intellectual property. And secondly, if we were a Linux or Linux-based society where everything is shared, then I get where he's coming from, but originality is also part of what he's appropriating and turning it into his own. So I can see why it's upsetting to the originator of that image.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. At the same time that we have a culture that is increasingly based on sharing and sampling, there are almost equally intensive battles over originality of intellectual property and efforts to fortify copyright law, which is why I think what Prince is doing in terms of challenging, going all out to challenge these copyright laws is at least interesting, even if one doesn't agree with his point of view, because as has become clear, increasingly clear, in the successive lawsuits in which he's engaged and in which he's made progressive, expansive inroads into the clarification of copyright law. Increasingly, what the courts are finding, in the United States at least, is that they are willing to entertain a broader definition of copyright law, one that allows for borrowing and sampling and so forth. Most of what is happening on the intellectual horizon with China and other countries has to do more with wholesale pirating of films and music and so forth for commercial purposes, right? So some of the discussion about Prince's work, some of the umbrage felt by the litigants who are suing Prince has to do with this financial transaction, like how their work is suddenly sold for a lot of money by some other artist. And that does pose an interesting analogy to what's happening in the trade wars, although sort of different legal systems at play.
Hi, touching more on the legal or challenging copyright laws, a lot of individuals here are queer, femme-identifying people of color who don't necessarily have a lot of the ability to challenge those laws and even begin that conversation, or even with the Detroit Instagram celebrity having problems with this and not being notified that they're part of it. How is this beginning to even talk about that if the people are not notified that that's even a part of it? Photos could be completely unchallenged. I'm questioning that.
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but are you saying that people who are represented in some of the appropriated works from Instagram would be interested in engaging in a larger conversation about representation?
Not about representation, but they don't even have a chance to realize they're a part of the show.
Right.
And address the copyright.
Yeah. No, I understand that. Yeah, it's a strange conundrum, and it becomes a very sort of one-sided act of appropriation. And I've heard this before, not only in the context of Richard Prince, but in other questions about people, pulling images off the internet for personal or educational use and not engaging in the original makers or the original owners, and people being frustrated, in part because the internet would theoretically make it much easier to engage in a dialogue rather than a one-sided action of taking. I completely understand and sympathize with that point of view. It just happens to not be part of Prince's process. But, I would say that it's a good opportunity to engage those different people and communities in this city in some sort of public conversations or forum, because a lot of the posts that Prince has appropriated have to do with questions of public presentation and identity, manifestations or performances of racial and sexual identity. That's interesting, and the posts that he has appropriated demonstrate that, but hopefully the dialogue doesn't stop there. Gotta wait for the microphone.
I guess like following up on that, my question is like, how does one have a dialogue when they don't even know that they're being a part of something? And like what is being done to create a dialogue besides just pure appropriation, as we're calling it, which is stealing, frankly.
Yeah, no, good point. What I'm suggesting is that I believe would have to be a sort of second order discussion based on, because, I mean, for whatever reason, and I haven't spoken to the artist about this, but for whatever reason, his way of going about this is not to reach out to the original poster, but really to just scrape the post from the internet and present it, I guess with the theory that, you know, the original poster is putting it out there on a public forum. Yeah. Right. Right. Yes, a way that is typically phrased is, well, it might be legal, but is it ethical, or is it socially appropriate, or is it the best way to approach this sort of communication or even critique within social media? That's, yes, a whole other question. I mean, one thing that I do think is spectacularly presented in this exhibition is the capacity of social media to provide a platform for these self-presentations. And, you know, it shows that people really rise to the occasion, and there's some extraordinary ways of demonstrating their social self just in the photographic portion of the post that Prince has appropriated.
I did. Hi.
Hi.
There's a common thread throughout the exhibition of a commenter by the name of Joan Katz, Katzz, and it's so prolific that I wondered if it was a pseudonym used by Prince, and you're a scholar of his, so I wondered if you knew that.
Yeah, that is Prince's handle, and you also see in some of the earlier ones Richard Prince number 4 or Richard Prince 1, 2, 3, 4 or something like that. So yeah, that's the text itself. Yeah. In one of the court dispositions, in one of the court depositions, the lawyers asked Prince, like, what's going on with this, like, text here? And he claimed that he claimed that it's just gibberish. But I think there's actually some interesting sort of riffing with language in those, and you know, it's all kind of obscure.
It's ethically moral or like it's socially moral. I mean, it seems like the ultimate stage. I mean, like it's compounded on how many likes you get. So whether or not, like, you know, someone's like doesn't like it this way or doesn't like it that way, I feel like they're being socially motivated. Like, when you look at what's on display, isn't this the ultimate form? Like, to rise to this level? It's an Instagram thing. I mean, in terms of even just the subject matter,
You're saying this is the ultimate forum for whom?
507 likes, 507 likes to, you know, this has to be.
Oh, why people would object to being in the show?
Yeah.
Right.
Or being
Well,
being objectified without like monetary.
that would be one theory, that this is their goal, to have greater visibility.
I'm not sure if they were asked, but
Right.
actually.
Yeah, I think the issue is that they weren't asked, but.
Yes, thank you. I'm curious about the Marlboro Man work that he's really well known for. He was making comments about society through our commercials and our advertisements. He seems to be going deeper and deeper into the people. There's kind of the public, and then there's the personal. Has he always wanted to go in that way? Or do you see an evolution of his art in terms of going macro down to micro? And can you talk about that, please?
As I was suggesting in the paper, I think that he's always been interested in, what art history calls portraits, pictures of people. Prince has always been interested in how they are shaped by visual representations and social stereotypes. So before the Marlboro advertisements, he did a long series of male portraits of, sort of mid-level catalog magazine models. So sort of generic males, almost like mannequins, and you have a series of them all looking one direction or looking another direction or something like that. So it's a combination of these two things, to investigate the question of how one constructs a social presentation of self, and two, how the institutions of society attempt to shape that through providing different kinds of models. So to me, I showed work by Sherry Levine, Cindy Sherman, Barbara Kruger, who were all friends of his who were working on questions of female identity and female representation in the media. And I think in some ways the Marlboro Men were Prince's response to look at male identity or masculinity as depicted in advertising at the time.
How you doing? So please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, but in your analysis, it appeared that you were giving a lot of value to his ability to take the original works and give a different type of context based off of the new pieces that he created with the comments below it. But what I'm getting at is if he's trying to suggest or make some type of comment about identity and uniqueness in some way, I'm trying to figure out what, across all of his pieces, make his contribution unique aside from the original works that he appropriated. Does that make sense?
So how is his work adding to questions of identity?
Essentially, how is he achieving what you claim to be what makes his work compelling?
Right.
If what makes, to me at least, what I see in these pieces, what makes it truly unique and what the identity is represented is the original pieces that he appropriated.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious where that comes through and what he contributed.
I actually think that's a really great point, because one of the things that he does that I would say is, a curatorial or editorial act is to make a selection of extraordinary or exemplary or even typical examples from the thousands, millions of representations on the internet of how people present themselves. And yes, you could say, as a lot of the original posters have said, that is their self-presentation. But I think Prince is saying, I'm adding something new by pulling it out of that context, juxtaposing it with other like-minded things, drawing attention to it, and giving a space for a certain discussion or dialogue around the issues presented in the original work. Right? I don't really see those as necessarily separate activities. There are a lot of artists who function curatorially in that way. They find things in the world. I mean, in some ways, that's what artists do. They point to things in the world and try to focus viewers' attention to think about them in a different way. I think that's an important role for art of all kinds.